Hi, how are you? So in this video, I'm going to tell you about the stereo system that I used back in the 1990s. Now, I use this thing practically every day. It was a real favorite of mine. It was an all-in-one kind of system. I remember back in the 70s and into the 80s, most stereo systems were component-based. That is, the tape deck, the turntable, the receiver, the amplifier, they would all be very separate pieces. And I remember my mother and my father had a Sears stereo, and it was all like that. It was big, bulky components that were in a cabinet with a glass door. But as the 80s progressed, and certainly as we got into the 90s, there was more of a trend of stereos kind of being all in one big piece. And that's what I had back in the 90s, and it was a Panasonic SG-D16. And this was a dual cassette AM/FM turntable stereo system. And again, I used this thing a lot back in the day. It was probably my main way to listen to music for probably at least a decade, if not longer. So just to describe this thing, it had dual cassette, and so you could dub from one cassette to another. I didn't really do this a lot back in the day. I mean, once in a while, a friend of mine would lend me a tape and I would make a copy of it, but that's really not what I used this machine for. And I also remember this thing had high-speed dubbing. I'm sure many of you remember this. This was an option back in the day for a lot of stereos and a lot of ghetto blasters with dual cassette. You could get high-speed dubbing. And I remember 9 times out of 10 when you did this, it sounded awful. The copies that you would make with high-speed dubbing, to my ears, they always sounded very thin and tinny and shrill, and they just had an awful sound to it. So I almost never used the high-speed dubbing option. But it played cassettes very, very well, and I remember the overall sound was very good. It had a simple little 3-band equalizer. It had a balance slider so you could move from left to right. And you had 4 buttons where you could choose between, tape deck, tuner, auxiliary, or turntable. And on the subject of auxiliary, the one piece of this stereo that was separate was the CD player. There was a Panasonic CD player that I think was intended to be used with this stereo system, and I did have it. And you just run a set of RCA cables from the back of the CD player into the auxiliary jacks on the back of the unit. So that's how you would play your CD player. I remember the receiver worked very good. The antenna on this thing was basically just a wire hanging out the back of the stereo. And it had AM, FM. Now the turntable was probably the weakest part of this whole stereo system. I remember playing records on this thing and it sounded horrible. It just had a very thin, mid-range, kind of weak sound. It just didn't sound full-bodied at all. It just had a very narrow, thin sound that I really didn't like. And at the time, I eventually got my hands on a Radio Shack turntable, which I've reviewed in another video, so I encourage you to look that up if you're interested. But yeah, usually I would just use the realistic turntable if I wanted to listen to records because it sounded so much better than the one included with this Panasonic 5G-D16 stereo system. It had a great big volume knob. I remember the volume knob was huge and it had a nice smooth movement to it. So anytime you adjusted the volume, it felt really good. It came with 2 simple little speakers. Each speaker was about, 10 inches tall, maybe 11 or 12 inches tall. Little bookshelf speakers, wooden speakers. And they sounded fairly decent too. I mean, you couldn't expect too much from them. But just for playing music in my little bedroom, they were just fine. And I'll also mention too, in terms of the AM/FM receiver, you could pre-program your favorite stations. So basically you could just hit a button and it would automatically take you to your favorite stations, which was very, very handy and very convenient. And that was pretty much it. That was the Panasonic 5G-D16, my 90s stereo system. Again, I remember this style being very, very popular back in the day. And you can still stumble upon a lot of these units in secondhand stores, in thrift stores. You may not find this exact model, this Panasonic, but yeah, there was a lot of stereo systems manufactured kind of in the late 80s to mid 90s that looked exactly like this, sort of these all-in-one double cassette tuner turntable kind of thing with an auxiliary jack on the back for CD player. And yeah, I see them quite frequently in various secondhand stores. But yeah, I have to say I was quite happy with this Panasonic 5G-D16. It always worked very good for me, and I always really enjoyed it. And just so you know, I still own this thing. It's actually still in storage out at my mother and father's house. Thank you for watching. Hope you can join us again next time. Please feel free to leave a comment, give us a thumbs up. And if you haven't already subscribed, please do. It really helps my channel grow, and it's greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. We'll see you again next time. Take care. Bye-bye.